Have you ever been pushed so far that something inside you fundamentally changed? Carl Jung documented a transformation so terrifying he called it the death of the empath and birth of something dangerous. It's not a breakdown. It's shadow integration under extreme duress. Jung observed empaths absorbing abuse for years until one betrayal pushed them past their breaking point. Here's what really happens when an empath is pushed too far. They don't snap, they awaken to abilities that make manipulators flee. The pattern began appearing in Jung's practice around 1917, though the full significance wouldn't reveal itself for years. Patients arrived at his Zurich clinic exhibiting what other physicians dismissed as nervous exhaustion or hysterical episodes, but Jung noticed something these doctors missed. These weren't people breaking down from weakness, they were people transforming from accumulated pressure. Jung's first documented case involved a woman in her mid-30s who had spent 15 years as what he described as the family's emotional repository. She absorbed her alcoholic father's rage, mediated her siblings' conflicts, and managed her husband's insecurities. She came to Jung because she had stopped sleeping. But that wasn't the disturbing part. Jung wrote in his case notes, "The patient reports she no longer feels fear. She describes it as if some protective mechanism that governed her responses has simply switched off. She says she now sees everyone clearly, including their manipulations, and feels nothing but cold observation." Other psychiatrists might have diagnosed dissociation or emotional numbness. Jung recognized something entirely different. This woman hadn't disconnected from reality. She had connected to a part of herself she'd suppressed for decades. Here's what made Jung's observations so unsettling. The transformation didn't happen gradually. It happened in a single moment. The woman described waking up one morning after her husband blamed her for his affair, and something inside her had fundamentally shifted. She used the phrase that would appear in dozens of Jung's later cases. "The old me died that night." Jung realized he wasn't witnessing psychological collapse. He was documenting what he would later term forced individuation. When an empath is pushed past their threshold, their psyche doesn't fragment, it integrates, and what emerges from that integration terrified even Jung. Here's what made Jung's blood run cold as he documented more cases. The transformation followed an identical pattern across every patient. There was always a final betrayal. Not the first betrayal, not the worst betrayal, but the one that came after years of accumulated pain when the empath had nothing left to give. Jung observed what he called the threshold moment. The empath would reach a point where their usual empathic response simply stopped functioning. They described it like a switch flipping, a door closing, or in one patient's words, like watching myself die and someone else wake up in my body. But here's where Jung's observations became truly disturbing. This wasn't dissociation or a trauma response. Brain function didn't decrease. It intensified. These empaths reported suddenly seeing patterns they'd ignored for years. They could recall every manipulation, every lie, every moment they'd been used. Their memory became photographically precise. Jung wrote, "The patient describes experiencing what she calls sudden clarity. She states she can now see the entire architecture of how she's been exploited, not with emotion, but with the precision of a surgeon identifying diseased tissue." One patient, a man named Thomas, told Jung, "I spent 20 years making excuses for my family. Then one day I woke up and could see exactly what each person had taken from me when they'd done it, and how they'd made me believe it was my fault. It was like someone turned on lights in a room I'd been stumbling through in the dark." Here's what Jung realized that changed his entire approach to these cases. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. The empath's survival mechanism had finally overridden their people-pleasing programming. Their psyche was integrating their shadow, the part of themselves they'd suppressed to maintain relationships with people who didn't deserve their energy. Jung termed this the death of the false self. The person who absorbed everyone's pain, who made themselves small, who apologized for existing. That person was dying. And what emerged in their place was something Jung found both beautiful and terrifying. If you've ever experienced a moment where you suddenly saw years of manipulation clearly, comment, "The fog lifted and I saw everything." But Jung discovered something even more disturbing about what happens after this transformation. The awakened empath doesn't just gain clarity. They develop 3 specific capabilities that Jung documented across dozens of cases. Capabilities that fundamentally shift every relationship in their life. The first capability: perfect pattern recognition. Jung observed that transformed empaths could now identify manipulation the moment it began. They'd spent years absorbing psychological data about everyone around them, learning behavioral patterns, cataloging emotional tactics. They'd just never used this information consciously. Jung wrote, "The patient demonstrates an extraordinary ability to predict others' behaviors with unsettling accuracy. She can identify manipulation strategies before they're fully deployed. This isn't paranoia. When tested, her accuracy rate exceeds 90%. One patient, Rebecca, described it to Jung this way: "I used to think I was reading too much into things. Now I realize I was reading things perfectly. I just didn't trust myself. I can watch someone's micro-expressions and know exactly what they're about to do. It's not a gift. It's just that I'm finally paying attention to what I've always seen." The second capability: complete emotional detachment from those who've caused harm. Jung documented that these empaths didn't become cold or cruel. They simply stopped feeling obligated to people who'd exploited them. The guilt that once controlled them disappeared entirely. Jung noted, "The patient reports zero emotional response when her mother attempts familiar manipulation tactics. She observes her mother's behavior with clinical interest, but feels no compulsion to respond. This represents a complete severing of the emotional bonds that previously governed the relationship." A patient named Marcus told Jung, "My father called me selfish for the first time in my life when I refused to lend him money. Before, that word would have destroyed me. I would have apologized and given him everything. Now, I felt nothing. I just watched him try every manipulation tactic he'd used for 30 years, and I was fascinated by how transparent it all was." The third capability proved most disturbing to Jung. These empaths developed what he called strategic empathy. They could still read emotions and understand psychological states, but they now chose consciously whether to respond. Their empathy became a tool they controlled, rather than an automatic response that controlled them. Jung's private notes reveal his concern. The patient demonstrates the ability to understand others' emotional states without being moved by them. She can identify someone's pain, their fears, their needs, and consciously decide whether engaging serves her. This is empathy weaponized through consciousness. Here's what truly terrified Jung about these 3 capabilities combined. The awakened empath became nearly impossible to manipulate while maintaining perfect awareness of how to influence others. They understood human psychology at a level that took Jung decades to develop, and they'd learned it through survival. Jung observed that people sensed this shift immediately, even if they couldn't articulate what changed. Manipulators who once controlled these empaths suddenly felt exposed and nervous around them. They couldn't explain why, but they knew their usual tactics wouldn't work anymore. If people started avoiding you after you found your power, comment, "They sensed I could see through them now." The most disturbing part came when Jung followed these patients over years and decades. He expected them to eventually soften, to return to old patterns, to forgive and reconnect with people who'd hurt them. It never happened. The transformation was permanent. Jung documented in his private notes, "I have observed these patients for 15 years post-transformation. Not one has reverted to their previous empathic patterns. They remain selectively empathetic, strategically boundaried, and psychologically impenetrable to manipulation. This suggests the integration of shadow material at this level is irreversible." Here's what Jung realized that changed everything he thought he knew about empaths. They hadn't become less empathetic. They'd become consciously empathetic. And consciousness, Jung understood, was what transformed victims into forces of nature. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." These empaths had done exactly that. They accepted their capacity for detachment, their ability to say no, their right to protect themselves, and their power to see through everyone around them. This complete self-acceptance made them psychologically untouchable. But what made Jung's hands shake as he wrote his observations was how this transformation affected entire family systems and social networks. When an awakened empath stopped absorbing dysfunction, every dysfunctional person in their orbit was forced to face themselves. Alcoholic parents could no longer use them as emotional dumping grounds. Narcissistic partners lost their supply. Manipulative friends found their tactics suddenly ineffective. Jung observed, "The awakened empath doesn't destroy these systems through confrontation. Their mere presence, their refusal to participate in unconscious patterns, causes these systems to collapse or evolve. They become what I call consciousness catalysts, forcing everyone around them to either grow or reveal their true nature." One patient told Jung 5 years after her transformation, "My entire family said I changed, that I wasn't the same person anymore. They were right. I'm not. The person who absorbed their dysfunction died, and I'm not apologizing for her death anymore." If you've been accused of changing by people who benefited from the old you, comment, "I didn't change, I just stopped pretending." Jung's final insight still resonates today. The empath pushed too far doesn't become broken. They become what humanity desperately needs. Someone who can feel everything without being destroyed by it, see everything without becoming cynical, and love deeply without losing themselves. Jung understood that this transformation serves evolutionary purpose. These awakened empaths stop enabling dysfunction and start modeling what conscious relationships look like. They show others that empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice, that kindness doesn't mean weakness, and that seeing clearly doesn't make you cruel. The question Jung left us with isn't whether empaths will be pushed too far. It's whether they'll recognize the transformation for what it is. Not the end of who they are, but the birth of who they were always meant to become. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For empaths, that privilege is earned through fire, and what emerges from that fire isn't damaged, it's forged. If you've stopped being everyone's emotional support and started protecting your energy, comment, "I choose me now."